But we're continuing our Genesis series, talking about the life of Joseph. And I also wanted to say thank you to everybody who served with VBS. I heard that it went really well. So thank you for your service. Yeah. And also thank you, Felice, for sharing your story, too. I know that can be intimidating, and it's great to hear about how God's worked in your life. So thank you for that. But as we're transitioning into talking about Genesis, this passage we're focusing on today has a lot to do with trust. That's going to be a key theme in the life of Joseph as a whole. And in our passage today, trust is going to be a major thing. And as I was thinking about trust, I was thinking about the movie Jurassic Park, okay? And that may not be abundantly obvious at first, okay? But the movie Jurassic Park has a lot of trust and trust issues that come up, right? The owner of the park trusts these scientists to, one, be able to develop this technology. He trusts the paleontologist to give him a positive review so his investors won't kick him out. And probably most importantly for the plot, he trusts this guy named Dennis Nedry to set up the computer system for the park, okay? And so Dennis Nedry sets up all the electronics for Jurassic Park, okay? And he's doing his coding thing, setting everything up for them, and they are implicitly trusting him, okay? Samuel L. Jackson's character seems to do no quality assurance work whatsoever, right? He just kind of sits by and lets it happen. And what the owner of the park doesn't know is that Dennis Nedry has been contracted to steal dinosaur embryos from the park. And so they've placed their trust in this guy who is going to ultimately betray them, right? And so Dennis Nedry basically has this hack that he does to the system that he's created where he goes, you didn't say the magic word, okay? And if you've seen it, you know, okay? And so he does this, and so all the security systems are down, and this is what instigates the rest of the entire plot where the dinosaurs attack people, and Steven Spielberg does a great job. So if you haven't seen it, you should watch it, okay? And so they put their faith, their trust in the wrong person, right? They trust this guy who will ultimately betray them. And in the story of Joseph, it's essentially asking, will Joseph trust God, or will he trust himself, or other people, right? Who he puts his trust in is pivotal, okay? And that's what we're going to see in Genesis chapter 40, which is where we're going to be camping out today. So if you want to go ahead and turn there in your Bibles, it's the first book of the Bible, and then it's the big number 40, if you want to turn there. So we're in Genesis chapter 40, and as you turn there, some additional context in case you haven't been here with us every week. Okay, Joseph has been betrayed by his brothers. Okay, he's his dad's favorite. His brothers betray him. They sell him into slavery, which they decided was better than killing him. Still not great, obviously. So that happens. He then does a great job while he is under this guy named Potiphar, and he rises through the ranks and becomes the number one guy in the household and is very prosperous. But then his boss's wife falsely accuses him of trying to sleep with her, and he's thrown in jail. And that kind of brings us to where we're at in Genesis chapter 40. But let me pray before we get into our text today. God, we thank you for your word. We just pray that our hearts, all of our hearts here today, would be open to what you have to say through your word, that your Spirit would work through your word to open up our eyes to any sin we have in our lives, that it would open up our eyes to ways we can love you more. And so I just pray that in this text, we would see you and what you're doing in the world, and that it would affect our lives on a daily basis. So we just pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so let's just jump right in to Genesis chapter 40. And here's what Moses has to say. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody, And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. A little repetitive there. And each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dreams there was a vine before me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." When the chief baker saw the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. And the birds will eat the flesh from you. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." And that's our text for today. Okay? And so here, Joseph is essentially in prison for an uncertain amount of time, right? We don't know how long total he spends in jail, but it seems to be a long period of time, okay? Whether it's weeks, months, years even, we don't know. But what we do know based off of the previous chapter is that Joseph has been successful even as a prisoner, right? He has risen through the ranks. He has additional responsibilities. He's in charge of other prisoners, which is something even in certain prisons in countries they still do to this day. So he has this responsibility even in jail. And we see specifically he's given charge over 2 high-ranking officials. Okay, we have the cupbearer and the baker. And we know what a baker is in our context. We have bakers. There's the Athens Baking Company that's right down the road, right? That makes sense to us. It tracks with us. He's feeding the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, okay? But in our context, we don't really have cupbearers anymore, as far as I'm aware, okay? And the cupbearer had 2 main responsibilities. Responsibility number 1, make sure nobody poisons the Pharaoh, okay? Common practice if you wanted to kill off a leader was to poison their wine, right? The alcohol covers up some of the weird taste that might be in that wine. So their job is to make sure that this wine is not poisoned, and he's kind of a security measure for the king of Egypt here. But function number 2 is quality assurance, okay? So he's making sure the king gets the good wine that goes with his food. So he's kind of like a sommelier, if you will, at the same time. So security sommelier is what you think cupbearer there, okay? Very interesting type of responsibility that he has. But these people were very important, okay? We might not think food service as a high-ranking job in our day, but if you really think about it, these 2 men combined are responsible for everything that the Pharaoh eats and drinks. So that they have a lot of responsibility in making sure he doesn't get assassinated, he remains healthy, and things like that. So this is a really important job for one of the most important men in the world, Pharaoh, because Egypt is one of the superpowers in the world at this time. So it's a lot of responsibility to make sure these men have everything that they need. And something else interesting to notice about this passage is the location. Right? It says, in the household of the captain of the guard. And if we go back to chapter 39, the captain of the guard is Potiphar. Okay? So unless something drastic has changed, right? Unless there's been a changing of the captain of the guard, it seems very likely that he is still in Potiphar's house to a degree. All right? So that's not a for sure thing, but it seems quite likely that that's the case, that he's still in Potiphar's household. And it's not surprising that these high-ranking officials would be kept close to the Pharaoh's court in case they need to recall them, like we see at the end of chapter 40. And so Joseph is given this great responsibility to serve these men and make sure that they have everything that they need. And I also want to bring our attention to verse 8, right? Joseph asks a rhetorical question, right? He asks, is not dream interpretation of God, or does not God have control over the dream interpretation? Okay, and in our context, because we're in church, we're probably like, yes, God does have power over that, right? We just assume that that's the case. But in Joseph's context, he's in Egypt. And in Egypt, they would say, we can practice dream interpretation by learning it. Like if we learn the correct steps, we can interpret other people's dreams. It's more of like a scientific approach or some sort of art of dream interpretation that can be learned from other people. And we have all sorts of evidence of this in archaeologically, all sorts of tablets that show different techniques of dream interpretations, different incantations that you could do to interpret dreams. And Joseph is speaking against this idea, right? Because the baker and the cupbearer, they're not upset because they don't think the dream can be interpreted, but because there is no one they think can interpret it, right? So one of these people who practices dream interpretation. But Joseph says, no, dream interpretation is only of God. Only if God gives it to us can we actually do this. So he's speaking against their culture. He's speaking against the Egyptian practice of dream interpretation. And in our context, this is something that still occurs. This is something people still practice. There are people through tarot card reading that will try to interpret dreams. There are people that will practice different new age practices, such as lucid dreaming, to try and control their dreams, draw more meaning out of their dreams. So it's not too foreign from our context to see things like this happen. All right? And so Joseph speaks against that. He says, no, God alone is the one who can give us interpretation of dreams. It's not something that we have control over as humans. Okay? And so then the next common question is, okay, well, if Joseph is saying that, do we have dream interpretation in our day? This is a common question. Can we interpret our own dreams today? And I think there's several principles we need to think about with dream interpretation. One, we shouldn't base it just off of one text if we're going to look for a proof text, okay? And in the Bible, we really only see two main characters who interpret other people's dreams, okay? We see that with Joseph here in Genesis 40 and 41. And we also see this with Daniel, as we read Daniel this past spring, right? He interprets different kings' dreams. Okay, so we really only have two main examples of interpreting other people's dreams. So we should be cautious and hesitant if someone says, oh, I have a dream interpretation for you, because there's not really much biblical evidence of that occurring. Okay, so we should be very cautious. And if someone claims that to us, we should hold them to the standard of the prophets in the Old Testament, right? If they're going to say that's going to happen, they better be right? Because the Old Testament says, if somebody says this is going to happen and it doesn't, they are a false prophet, and we should not listen to them at all, okay? And in fact, the Old Testament says you should stone them, okay? Not advocating for stoning people, okay? Just really clear, I'm not saying that, all right? But the principle is this is a very serious offense if someone says this is going to happen and God's telling me that and they're wrong. So you should be very careful if someone is claiming to do that. Another biblical principle is that a lot of times when we see God speak to people in dreams, the person, one, knows that it's God. There's no question whether God's speaking to them in the dream. And the second principle is it's very clear what God is telling them to do. Okay, there's not a question of what God is saying or who is speaking to them. It's very clear. Okay, so for example, Jacob earlier in Genesis, God appears to him in a dream and he says, go here and do this. And Jacob says, I know God is speaking to me. I'm going to go and do this thing. So what the common actual application would be, we should know God is speaking to us. There shouldn't be any question if we think God is speaking to us in a dream. Okay, so if we think that's happening, I think it's still possible, but I don't think it's as common as some people think it is, all right? And I think the main way we see this in our context or in the world in general today is in Muslim populations, okay? A lot of people will say, I see a dream of Jesus, and that's what actually led me to Christ, was seeing this dream in a context where there's not a lot of public churches and things like that. So I think it is definitely still possible, maybe not common, and we should use great caution if we're going to put any weight in dreams and things like that. So we use great caution, hold them to biblical standards of what they're saying, and typically, if God is speaking to us in a dream, it's very clear that he is the one talking and what we're supposed to do, okay? So that is to answer maybe a controversial question. Feel free to ask questions afterward if you're like, I disagree with you, okay? Totally fine. We can talk about it. So that's what we see with dream interpretation and Joseph. Okay, and moving on in the text, we see Joseph's interpretation is very confident. Okay, he says this is the interpretation. And also, the author doesn't give us any sense of hesitation or pausing. He doesn't record any praying to see if this is what is said, but he seems to have absolute confidence that this is what God is saying through these dreams. Okay, he just says this is the interpretation immediately following it. Okay, and he says, this is what's happening. Okay, and in the cupbearer's dream, it's a really positive thing that he's going to be free. And Joseph says, I'm so confident that you're going to be free that I'm going to ask you to do me a favor when you are free, right? Help talk to the Pharaoh to get me out of here so I can make my case and be free. It's a really positive thing for this cupbearer. But then on the other hand, the baker, it's not so positive, okay? You're going to be beheaded, and then they're going to hang you up on a tree, okay? So they're going to nail him to a tree somehow, right? Really gruesome picture for him. And we also see a lot of wordplay happening here, right? The cupbearer, his head is downcast in the passage, but then he's lifted up and freed. And then we have the baker, and he is downcast, but then he is lifted up. Okay, but in a very different way. Okay, so a little bit of dark humor almost there, right? So it's a contrast between the two. And we don't have any sort of insight into the 3-day waiting period either, right? It doesn't talk about them anxiously waiting to either get out or potentially be killed, right? The narrator just skips to, does it come to pass what Joseph's going to say here? And we see that Joseph's interpretation is of God because it does come to pass. And the cupbearer is ultimately freed and the baker is executed. But despite this miraculous occurrence where Joseph not only gives one person an accurate dream interpretation, he gives a second correct dream interpretation, the guy completely forgets about him, okay? And you'd think if somebody said, you're going to be free in 3 days, and then it happens, right? You're going to remember that guy saying that to you, but somehow he forgets, okay? And that might seem crazy to us, but I think honestly, we forget so many things, right? And I think that's actually what makes it more realistic is that he doesn't just get him out and it doesn't work perfectly as a story, but he forgets about him and just kind of leaves him hanging. And Joseph is kind of just stuck there. And so at this point in the story, we almost have like, well, is Joseph going to get out or is he not? And how is God working in the middle of this, right? And Joseph's story up to Genesis 40 is quite tragic, right? He is a guy who was his dad's favorite, okay? He shouldn't play favorites, obviously, sad. But, okay, he's dad's favorite, and his brothers say, we're going to kill him. And then they say, no, we're going to put him in slavery. And then he's enslaved for years, rises to the top, is finally in a good place in his life, and then he's falsely accused of a crime, gets thrown in jail, and then he has a hint of hope that finally I will get out of jail because this guy can put in a good word. He's in a high position. He's close to the Pharaoh. It's going to work out for me. And then the guy completely forgets about him, right? And so Joseph's life is so depressing up to this point because he's on this roller coaster of emotions, right? You'd almost rather it just be bad than have the hope given right there in front of you, okay? But Joseph is like, oh, yay, oh, no, oh, yeah, oh, no. What's happening, okay? And so Joseph's life is quite depressing. But what is God saying to us in our context through Joseph's life so far, okay? I think the first thing we see God saying is that we should humble ourselves and admit the future is God's alone. Humble ourselves and admit the future is God's alone. And when I say humble ourselves, I don't mean, yeah, God says you should be humble, so be humble, all right? That's not what I'm trying to say. But I think Genesis 40 presents this picture of a God who is powerful, in control, and knows the future, right? And we should be aware of the beauty of that God and the greatness and power of that God. And seeing those attributes of him, we should respond with humility. So our humility as Christians is not just we're going to grin and bear it, we're going to be self-deprecating and think badly of ourselves. But humility as a Christian is a proper recognition of God's glory, goodness, and power. Right? That's what we see with Joseph. He understands God is in control of the future. He understands God is with him in the middle of this. And he humbles himself as a result and is looking for what God might be doing in the midst of his suffering. So he humbles himself in response to what he knows to be true about who God is. Right? And some of us might be like, well, humbling ourselves, that doesn't really sound like an easy process. But here are some things to think about with humbling ourselves. Okay? And I think the first thing is to understand that our talents, our abilities, our money, anything we have, can do is ultimately because God gives us that. That's what John 15 says. We can do nothing apart from Christ. Nothing. And so when Jesus says nothing, he means you cannot do anything without him. Okay, and I think that's true. And we see that in the life of Joseph. He says, I don't have this dream interpretation. It's God who has the ability to do that. He doesn't have the ability to free himself. God is the only one who has the ability to free him. So first part of humility is understanding God is the one who gives us everything that we have, right? The lens of stewardship in everything in our lives. God has given us our time, our money, our possessions, any abilities or giftings we may have. It's all from God. And so when we have that perspective, it makes us much more humble. It makes us much more generous because we're not so focused on ourselves. We're focused on God. Okay? And this brings us to the next thing about being humble. We should think more about God than ourselves. Think more about God than ourselves, right? Joseph has not forgotten that God is with him, right? He's able to interpret the dreams, and if God was not with him, he says he would not be able to interpret the dream. He knows that God is with him, and he's looking for what God might be doing. God might be giving him this interpretation so that way he can eventually be free from prison. Okay, so he's saying God is doing something here. He's thinking about what God might be doing. Okay? And if we're thinking more about God than ourselves, this should reflect regularly in our lives. Like, are we reading our Bibles? Because that should stir us to think more about God. Are we praying about decisions in our life? Because that's pointing us towards God and what he might be doing in our lives, right? So this should be something that's a regular practice. What does God have to say about this? Is that our first question we ask? Or do we just kind of make our best decision using our own wisdom, right? That's something I'm super guilty of, is I'm just like, yep, this is the right decision, let's go do it. And maybe I don't take the time to actually say, what is God doing in this, right? And that should point me to think more about who God is and his wisdom in the situation. And the last thing about being humble is I think we need to trust more in God's plans than our plans, right? Joseph's plan was, I'm going to interpret this dream through God's power, and then, he'll get me out, right? But clearly that's not what God was doing, or else he would have escaped, right? Or he would have been able to make his case in front of Pharaoh, right? But we can't hold to our plans so tightly that we don't leave any room for what God might be doing in our lives, okay? We can't hold too tightly to them. I think sometimes this is why we become bitter and angry and frustrated with God, is because we have held so tightly to our plans for our lives that we leave no room for what God might actually be doing in our lives. And that's something that's hard, right? Because we have an idea and it seems so good to us. But God might have something that's even better for you. And that might seem trite in the moment, right? But that's something that we see fleshed out even in Joseph's life, who he suffered greatly in prison. He suffered greatly under his brothers. But he kept in mind that God might be doing something, and I'm going to trust his plan. And here's what John Calvin says about this passage. Okay, controversial choice, I know. But here's what he has to say about this passage. He says, Joseph teaches us that nothing is more improper than to prescribe the time when God will help us. For he deliberately, sometimes for a long time, keeps his people in anxious suspense, so that they may know for certain how to trust in God. Besides, in this way, God planned to publicly bring glory to himself when Joseph was set free from prison. For if Joseph had gained his freedom as a result of the entreaty of the cupbearer, it would have been generally believed that he had gained it as a result of the actions of a man and not those of God. Okay? So Calvin's saying, hey, God is doing something in this passage to bring himself glory, right? And also, the timing is going to be better for Joseph, right? Joseph can't see that now, right? He's blind to what God might be doing. But as we'll see next week, the timing is actually perfect to further bring Joseph good. Okay, that's what we'll see next week. Is Joseph gets even more good as a result of having to wait. And no doubt in the moment, Joseph would have been like, what could God be doing by making me wait? I've done everything I think I should be doing. What could God be doing? And it's not wrong to ask those questions, right? But we do need to trust God when we're asking him what he might be doing, right? We should be saying, what is God doing in this? And that's a sign of humility, asking God what he's doing in the midst of our suffering and difficulty. All right. That brings us to number 2. Does our character reflect this humble trust in the future God has in store? Does our character reflect this trust, right? Because if we really trust someone, it's not just some sort of out there, thing where it's like, yes, I trust in this person. But trust displays itself fully when we act upon the trust. Okay? If we truly trust someone, we will act upon that trust. And that's what we see with Joseph, right? He's completely confident God is with him. He gives the interpretation quickly, right? And so that's one way we see his character is it's his confidence and trust of God as evidence of his character. And we also see his character and the responsibility given to him, right? He's given a higher ranking job even when he's a prisoner, right? He's being faithful to do the work in the midst of his suffering and pain, okay? He's also attentive to the needs of others. He has not forgotten others. He notices the cupbearer and the baker are downcast, right? He's like, what is wrong? He's the one who initiates it. They don't come to him with the problems. He asks them about what's going on. And this shows that Joseph was not so focused on himself that he completely forgets others, but he's aware of what's happening around him and he cares for other people. And if we're honest, Joseph has so many reasons to just give up at this point, right? If you were, betrayed by your entire family, enslaved, and then thrown in prison, you would probably give up. I would probably give up, right? There's so many reasons for Joseph to give up in this scenario, but he's still paying attention to what's others out there. He's still being faithful, and he's still trusting God in the middle of this. And the New Testament affirms this too. That's what 1 Peter 4 says. Don't be surprised. 1 Peter talks about, don't be surprised by the fiery trial. Okay? So we should not be surprised when hard things happen to us as Christians. In fact, the New Testament is full of examples of suffering. Okay? So don't be surprised when it happens. But in 4:19, he talks about how we should let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good work. while doing good work. So even in the midst of the suffering, even in the midst of that fiery trial, doesn't sound pleasant, we are entrusting our souls to God, right? We trust him. We have faith in Jesus and his sacrifice for us. But then we also continue to work, right? We have that character we're talking about. And if we think about this suffering that happens, it often reveals our character. Suffering reveals our character and our trust in God. Okay, and a great example of this is the movie The Dark Knight. Okay, I know 2 movie examples one day. What am I doing? Okay, but The Dark Knight is such a good example of this that I couldn't keep it out. Okay, and so you have Batman and you have Harvey Dent, and they both love the same woman, so classic love triangle situation, okay? They love the same woman, and eventually what happens, I know spoilers, but it's been like 20 years, guys, come on. Okay, so they love the same woman, and ultimately she dies, okay? She dies, and so this is a tragedy for both Harvey Dent and for Batman. And so they both have to respond to their grief and their pain. What are they going to do? Okay? And Harvey responds by giving in to his own desires and bringing out his own justice, right? He basically says, this is what I think justice is. And he murders people, okay? Extreme response. But he murders people, and he goes down the path of pursuing his own will, and he doesn't have any trust in anything except for himself. And so when he becomes so inward and self-focused, he just pursues sin, okay? And then Batman, his response is, he struggles with his response, right? He's not sure what he's going to do, and he has moments where he looks like he's going to give in to his own desires to kill the Joker. But in the end of the day, he pursues justice, and he helps the police catch the Joker, right? So it displays ultimately the character. And at the beginning of the movie, you think Harvey Dent is this guy who's got it all together. He's doing the right thing. But when he suffers, the truth comes out that he's actually two-faced, right? He actually is presenting goodness on the outside, when in reality, he doesn't have the character, okay? So when we suffer, it reveals our character, and it's an opportunity to grow in our trust in God. I think what we see in the life of Joseph is someone who has suffered greatly, and this has produced great trust in God and great character, right? He knows God is working in the middle of it, and he responds by being faithful to do the right thing. All right. And then finally, number 3, Joseph's story reminds us of redemptive history and the pattern we see in the Bible. All right, and if you just want to go ahead and put the chart up there, that'd be great. So we have a little chart action here, okay? So there's an idea of redemptive history, okay? It's zooming out from Joseph's story to see the larger picture of what God is doing in the world, okay? So when we look at Joseph's life, he both has prosperity and he suffers, right? He's the head of the household of Potiphar, but then he's falsely accused and he's sent to prison, okay? And then he eventually becomes second to the king. So he has both that prosperity and that suffering. And we see this with Israel under Moses, okay? Israel is freed from their slavery in Egypt, and then they have a new covenant, a new relationship with God. But then in the wilderness journey, they suffer, okay? And then under the Israel and the monarchy, okay, David reigns and expands the kingdom. They prosper. But then ultimately, Israel sins and they are exiled from the promised land. And now, in our context, in the new covenant, Christ redeems us from sin and death. He dies for us. And if we have faith in him, we know we're made right with God. And we're put back into that right relationship, which was intended at the beginning of creation. But we now know, based off of passages like 1 Peter, that we will suffer for a time, even in our context. And so what we see when we zoom out to the big picture of the Bible is that we both have suffering and prosperity, okay? We have both these things will happen in our lives, and we should expect both of them, okay? So we shouldn't be surprised by the fiery trial. But what this pattern ultimately points us to is that the suffering is temporary. God intervenes and something happens with each of these suffering situations, right? And Jesus points us to the fact that this cycle will one day end. That one day we will no longer be in a cycle of prosperity and suffering. We will be in a place where there is no more pain, there is no more suffering, and we're with God in perfect relationship. So when we zoom out, we see this pattern and we can have hope that Jesus will one day bring the end to this cycle that Joseph is in and free us from pain and suffering if we have faith in Jesus. That's what we can hang our hat on and put all of our hope in, is that Jesus will bring hope. He will bring the end to our suffering. Okay, so let us cling to that as we go out of here. Cling to the hope we have in Jesus, that this cycle will one day end and we will no longer suffer. Let's pray. God, we are so thankful for your word. We're thankful for the example of Joseph being faithful in suffering, because when we suffer, it can be difficult to remember you and remember that you're doing work in the midst of our suffering. So we are thankful for that reminder. I pray that we would grow in our humility and our trust in you, not because we want to be self-deprecating or not think well of ourselves or accurately about ourselves, but we're humble because we're responding to your goodness and your greatness, that we see how good and big of a God you are and all your power, and that causes us to be humble, Lord. And I'm so thankful for seeing that example in Joseph. So I just pray that as we, as a church, go through times of suffering, as we go through times of even prosperity, that we would trust you, and that trust would play itself out in living a life that honors you. So we just pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.